So. All right, good morning. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the symposium. This session is session 1C, Air Pollution Across State Lines, Environmental Justice Report Back from Environmental Agencies in the Mid-Atlantic. Welcome to everybody in the room and welcome to our online viewers. Thank you for being here. My name is Rebecca Rear. I'm the Director of Climate Policy and Justice at the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and really happy to be here as the moderator today. And we're joined by 2 speakers. We have Joseph Jakuta, the Interim Associate Director, Air Quality Division at the Department of Energy and Environment in Washington, D.C., and Chris Hoagland, the Director of Air and Radiation Administration at the Maryland Department of the Environment. We're going to have presentations from each of our speakers for about 10 minutes each. If you have clarifying questions after each presentation, please shout them out. And we'll that includes the folks online, and then we'll get into some Q&A. I have some prepared questions, and then if we, depending on timing, you guys can go first, or I'll jump in. So make sure you have your questions written down and are ready to ask and engage in some dialogue. We will be using this microphone the whole time, just so that everybody online can make sure to hear us. But if you need help with audio or need us to be closer or farther from the mic, please do speak up and let us know what you need to be able to hear us better. So with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Chris to give about a 10-minute presentation. I'll be timing. And we're jumping in. Thanks again for being here.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. As Rebecca mentioned, I'm Chris Hoagland. I'm the Director of the Air and Radiation Administration at the Department of the Environment. We're the state's air pollution regulators. So we issue air pollution regulations that set rules that polluting industries have to follow to reduce their air pollution. And then we, for individual facilities, we put in their permits, the requirements for what they specifically have to do to reduce pollution, meet requirements to protect public health and the environment. So I'll be talking about environmental justice work here at MDE for the state of Maryland. So I'll cover a series of topics here. I'll talk about the environmental justice priority that we're working under. I'll talk about climate change and climate justice and some of the work we're doing in that area. I'll talk about the community partnerships that we've been launching to try to do things in new and better ways to address community concerns. I'll talk about how we're implementing a grant to do community air quality monitoring in several places across the state. Our screening tool that we're using to change permit processes. Some recent legislation with, a little bit of discussion perhaps about what's going to come in future legislative sessions, and then I'll close with some challenges and opportunities that we see from the state's perspective. So first, for the environmental justice priority, there is a strong priority and direction coming from the top in Maryland under this administration. The Governor Moore, has told us to leave no one behind. It's on all the signs when you enter the state, but it's also within the processes within the state agencies. The governor's been very clear about this. The Secretary of the Environment, the head of the department that I work in, she has identified this as her #1 priority. She's in the middle in that photo there. So very strong direction all the way from the top to do things in new and better ways to address environmental justice. One action the Secretary recently took is that she hired into the Secretary's office the state's first ever Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice. So a new dedicated professional and team in the Secretary's office to drive this throughout the organization. Her name is Anika Atkinson. She's speaking later today on a panel at 3 o'clock. 2 o'clock. It's at 2 o'clock. And I believe, Rebecca, you're moderating that one too. And she's building a dedicated team to make sure that the entire bureaucracy is reoriented around this priority. So a bit about climate change and climate justice. In Maryland, we take climate change very seriously. We have the most ambitious climate change goals in any state law of any state in the country. We have to reduce greenhouse gas pollution. That's what I mean by GHGs here. Greenhouse gas, this is the air pollution that causes climate change. We have to reduce the amount of that pollution coming from the state of Maryland by 60% by 2031 and to net zero by 2045. That 60% by 2031 is the most stringent goal of any state law in the country. If someday DC becomes a state, Maryland will drop to number 2, because DC's goal is actually 60% by 2030, a year ahead of us. So we look forward to not being number 1 on that point someday. But this is a very, very ambitious goal, and we need to move very quickly to meet it to address the threat posed by climate change. The law that established those goals also built new frameworks for environmental justice and climate justice, including definitions of how we understand if a community is overburdened by air pollution, and then so that we can then take that definition and do something about it in all the legal processes that the state implements. One thing about Maryland is that we're also reducing our greenhouse gas emissions fastest of any state. Every year, EPA does what they call a national greenhouse gas inventory. This is an assessment of all of that climate pollution being produced everywhere in the United States, and they publish it. And if you look at the 2022 numbers that just came out, the state that is moving the fastest of all of them is Maryland. We are right at the top of the list. We're reducing greenhouse gas emissions faster than anyone else. Fun fact, number 2 on that list, DC. So we've got good company on the panel here today. Despite the fact that we're moving very quickly, we are not moving fast enough. We need to move faster and faster every day and every year to meet our goals, not just because we want to meet our goals, but because the atmosphere really does care about whether we meet those goals, because they're based on the amount of pollution we're putting up in the atmosphere, which will affect our climate. So we need to continue to build on the momentum that we have, the good momentum that we have, address all of the challenges that come up every day. There are new challenges. If you follow the news on this topic, you see every day a new challenge in the news. And every day we need to overcome those challenges and move faster. Some of the good news here, in the government, when we're building our climate change approach, we talk about programs, we talk about new regulations, new rules. Fundamentally, what all of those things accomplish in the world, all the actual actions that end up being taken to reduce climate pollution, these are all investments in communities. These are investments in clean energy. These are investments in clean buildings, in clean businesses, in clean transportation, and clean homes that occur in communities throughout the state. That's how we actually reduce the amount of carbon pollution coming out of our homes and vehicles and into the air. And all of these investments drive better air quality, better quality of life, and economic opportunity in communities. And so as we build out this approach in Maryland under our laws, we can focus those investments in communities that have been left behind and communities that are overburdened by air pollution so that they can enjoy the benefits of this transition beyond just the benefits of addressing this big, abstract, global challenge of climate change, so we can get these tangible benefits in communities throughout the state. On the right, we issued a plan to meet those goals last December. You can find it online on MDE's website, mde.maryland.gov/climate change. So a bit about our community partnerships. We've been building partnerships with communities to see how we can do things, like I said, in new and better ways to address community concerns using the resources and the authorities that we have. Learn about what we can do right now and where there are gaps in our resources and authorities, what those gaps are so that we can hopefully fill them. Some of these elements of these community partnerships are that we're engaging a lot of community air quality monitoring. I'll talk a bit more about that soon, where basically we take a whole bunch of scientific equipment to measure air pollution and we concentrate it in a community. And we learn what is the pollution burden in that community, what pollutants are causing that pollution burden, what can we say about where those pollutants are coming from, and then what we can do about reducing pollution from those sources. We have also been launching targeted enforcement and inspection initiatives in community partnerships. We have a staff of inspectors at MDE who every day they hit the road, they spread out across the state, and they visit all the facilities that produce pollution, and they inspect them to ensure that they're following the rules to reduce pollution, catching the ones who aren't. We periodically are concentrating those resources in particular communities and saying we're going to visit, for example, every single polluting facility in the neighborhood of Curtis Bay in southwest Baltimore. We're going to concentrate our statewide inspection resources and just hit every source. Even if they're only legally required to be inspected every 2 years, we're going to visit all of them over the period of, say, a summer like we did a couple of years ago, or this month as we're doing right now. We also, in communities where diesel trucks are a big problem, which is most of the communities that are overburdened by air pollution, a major concern is diesel trucks. We'll go and we'll heavily enforce our diesel idling law. In Maryland, you're not allowed to idle a diesel truck for more than a couple of minutes. So we will go out and we will hand out flyers to all the truck drivers reminding them you're not supposed to idle your trucks. And then periodically state police will come in and do a surprise inspection sweep and give out citations to anybody who's violating that. And we'll concentrate those in areas where we know it's an issue when we can. We also deploy targeted pollution reduction programs, for example, where diesel trucks are a problem in, for example, communities surrounding the container terminal in the Port of Baltimore. We focus investment programs in switching out some of the trucks that haul containers back and forth to cleaner models. And then we're also building in greater collaboration on permit processes. I'll be asking for a couple more minutes, Rebecca. An example of air monitoring. This was a project that we were one of the partners for in the community of Curtis Bay in southwest Baltimore. Leaders from the organizations that led this are speaking in one of the other panels down the hall right now. And so we joined with the Community Association, the Land Trust, scientists from Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, elsewhere, to deploy a high-density pollution monitoring network. We're measuring lots of different air pollutants at the same time at a high density within the community to try to understand where different pollutants were coming from, with a particular focus on a source of great concern for the community, which is a coal export terminal next to the community. We also sampled dust, sampled dust from the community and analyzed it on a surface scanning electron microscope to conclusively determine that dust contained coal. So we published some initial results from this in December, and that's serving as evidence that we're now incorporating into a permit process. So we're trying to build out these air monitoring programs so that we get information, but that's also information that we can use, and we'll see how far we can take it within our legal authorities to get better results for the community. The report, we also included visits from mobile air monitoring labs from the University of Maryland and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as resident testimonials, videos, experiences from residents as evidence streams. We received a grant from the feds to deploy more community air monitoring in 3 communities in the state, shown here on the map. Cheverly and surrounding communities in Prince George's County, Curtis Bay, as I discussed, in southwest Baltimore, and Turner Station, one of the communities around the Port of Baltimore, in particular the container terminal. It's a community-driven process to identify the pollutants and concerning sources of concern and identify how we're going to measure that. For each community, there will be a package of air pollution sensors that MDE purchased with the grant funding. The rest of the funding is going to partners, especially Siege, our hosts today, to deploy the network, work with the community, identify issues, analyze the data, identify actions. So we'll be measuring a whole series of pollutants in each of these communities using this grant. Okay, that map I showed before is from our screening tool. The climate law I mentioned, defined overburdened community and underserved community, 2 different definitions based on a series of demographic and environmental health indicators. And we now use this tool in our permit processes. So whenever you apply for a permit in Maryland, you have to assess the pollution burden using this tool in the nearby area. And that's incorporated into the permit process, and in particular, we're requiring permit applicants to do more community engagement if they're in an area that scores high on this tool before they apply to us for a permit, to try to identify concerns and identify potential solutions before they even apply for a permit. And then we're building in more collaborative processes in that permit. Okay, some recent legislative changes. There was the climate law that established those criteria and the goals. There was the law that requires us to use that screening tool. Those were back in 2022. In the last 2 legislative sessions, there have been bills introduced to explicitly incorporate cumulative impacts and pollution burden into our authorities, expanding the assessment of pollution burden that we do in permits and giving us explicit authority to change our permits accordingly, which we do not have right now. Neither of those bills passed. Rebecca, I know that you were an observer in that process, so I did something dangerous. I tried to put on a slide what maybe the hardest question was that faced that process, which is how comprehensive should the types of permits and types of facilities covered by this new law be? That was a challenging question. The bill has not passed in the last 2 sessions, and that's something the state needs to figure out how and where is it appropriate to deploy new authority within the Department of the Environment to do permits differently in different communities. So to close, some challenges and opportunities. Resources. This is going to be a bunch of bureaucratic stuff. We work with resources and authorities. MDE has a traditional mission in the Clean Air Act and in Maryland law, and we are resourced to deploy that mission. For example, for air monitoring, we run an air monitoring network. There are 24 sites across the state that's called our regulatory air monitoring network. And we have people and we have equipment to deliver on that. And that is designed to measure air pollution across the entire state or across an entire metro area. It is not designed, it is not capable to measure impacts in a specific community at really great detail, right? So that's the equipment that we have. Measuring in a specific community, that's sort of a different task, right? And so we don't have a budget to do that. So we rely on partnerships, for example, with Siege, who's been very successful at deploying resources, and other university partners at University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins. So the state, we sort of jump in because we have experts in this area. We sometimes have some spare equipment. We can help get grants, but we rely on external partners to bring resources to bear. And for authorities, as I mentioned, we don't yet have explicit authority to say that a permit in this community should be different than a permit in that community because this community has higher pollution burden. We try to get the strongest permits we can in every case, and when we have information that the pollution burden is higher in a particular community, you know, we can continue to push, but we don't have explicit legal authority saying that we can, say, deny a permit in this community because its pollution burden is already too high. There are lots of opportunities here, though. There's a lot of priority in this area within the government and outside the government, exhibited by how much this symposium has grown year over year. This is a huge priority in the state. That's an opportunity for us to do more. There are new tools, the new technology that we're deploying in these community air monitoring projects. This is very, very powerful new technology, and we found really innovative ways to deploy that through the monitoring projects that we've completed so far. And there is new funding, a lot of federal funding. Now we're prioritizing that funding whenever we have access to it to get into projects rather than into the department's budget. But there's a lot of funding, and it's hitting the street, and it's doing work, and we're figuring out how to do it better. So there are lots of opportunities here to continue to do things in new and better ways that what we focused on and building out over time. Okay, sorry, Rebecca, I think I used more time. And I'm Chris Hoagland with the state of Maryland, directing the air pollution program. And next will be Joseph. The equipment? So these were communities that partnered with us on a grant application. Oh, sorry. The question was how did we end up with these 3 communities in this grant? And these are the communities that partnered with us on the application. These were communities where we knew that there were significant pollution and issues that had to be explored in greater detail. Yeah. This was one grant, $500,000. There are plenty more to come. Yeah. Oh boy, I don't know if I can list all 24 off the top of my head. So there are 3 related. There were 2 questions there. First is how could these community projects be replicated in Pittsburgh? The monitoring projects, what's available that could be deployed in Pennsylvania. The second one is what are the 24 demographic and environmental health indicators in our screening tool. So the second one, I can't answer off the top of my head. We can get you that list. It's in the tool. For the first one, I can't speak for Pennsylvania, but yes, I know that there are projects similar to this in Pennsylvania. The technology is available in Pennsylvania as well. The federal funding is available, and I'd be happy to connect you with counterparts in the state. Yeah.
I'll take a quick stab at expanding on the overburden and underserved definition for the 20. So as Chris mentioned, the definitions in Maryland state law, overburdened and underserved, two distinct definitions. So you can use those definitions. So you can have a law that then says, it can apply to overburdened communities, it can apply to underserved communities, or it can apply to overburdened and underserved. So depending on how you are targeting resources. A couple important things to note about those definitions. The research on what goes into those indicators originated here at the University of Maryland with Siege. So it's a really good partnership where we're seeing real-time EJ research and advocacy from community members about getting definitions in law actually then pass through a mechanism like the Climate Solutions Now Act that we knew was going to pass. Those definitions started out in a different law. And when we saw that law wasn't going to pass, but the Climate Solutions Now Act was, advocates worked really hard to take this community-driven definition work and put it into a legislative mechanism that was going to pass. So it's sort of a little bit of inside game there, but important work. And the definitions of underserved is limited English proficiency, race, and income. So underserved is about access to resources, right? We recognize that there are indicators we can use to identify communities we know have faced historic barriers to access to resources. That is underserved. The definition of overburdened is about the pollution and health burden that communities face. And that's a much longer definition. And if your census tract is 75th percentile or more in the state for 3 or more of those indicators, your census tract is categorized as overburdened. And a lot of that is based on NADA data, so cancer risk and risk of, I think, heart disease, asthma, things like that. But again, I can't, like Chris, haven't completely memorized the list, but it's in state law. And we see that being used in further allocation of resources. A beautiful example of that was a piece of legislation that passed last year on the state's comprehensive flood management grant program. So that the Climate Solutions Now Act passed in 2022 put those definitions in law. In 2024, a law passed that said there's the comprehensive flood management grant program. We want to put more money into it, and we want to say at least 40% of the money that's being allocated to this program goes to projects in or directly benefiting communities that are overburdened or underserved. So now that those definitions are in state law, a lack of definition can no longer be an excuse for inaction, and we can use those definitions to allocate resources, particularly when it comes to things like Justice 40. And so we're seeing real-time impact of further defining environmental justice in law and further defining indicators in law. So state law, Maryland state law. Yep. So, sorry, I can nerd out about that for a while. So just hope that helps with some of the indicators. And we can absolutely circulate a list of the indicators that were used. Oh yeah, one more clarifying question.
Yes, a good question. The question was, as we are looking at these grants, what can we do to expand the work into rural communities, including the Lower Eastern Shore of Maryland? And I think it's a great question, and that's an area where we definitely identified more work is to be done, and I know that there is more work right now being funded largely by Johns Hopkins and MDE. We've been trying to help get the equipment calibrated and ready, et cetera. But yeah, I think that's definitely an area where we could use more attention and use more resources. Yeah, right. Yeah.
One more question. The cumulative impact, when that gets passed, then can the permits be changed, the criteria?
Yeah, it would sort of, I guess, depend on what the law looks like when it's passed, right? So it's hard to speak about hypotheticals. But yeah, we don't right now have the authority to say that this community's permit has to be different from this one, or that we can simply say no in this one or that one. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, where's the community's voice in this in particular, if a facility is getting placed in a community? And so part of what we've been trying to do is bring more community agency into the state processes, especially I think what would be relevant there is a permit process, right? When someone wants to build something in a particular place and they apply to us for a permit, right? And so what we are doing now is identifying in the areas on this map that are colored dark blue because they score above 75th percentile, we're saying there needs to be more community engagement as part of this permit. And we are in some cases requiring things that are well beyond the actual legal minimum for how we get community input. So we're trying to, give more agency to the community voice by having, at a minimum, greater participation opportunities. and then working to the extent we can within our legal authorities to build in better protections on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, so the question was about a new development happening in Pittsburgh with additional industrial activity and associated truck traffic, and what can the community do about that. I guess I'm not an expert on Pennsylvania's rules and processes, so I can't speak too much specificity, but I guess at a minimum, maximize whatever engagement opportunities you have with the relevant authority, which in Pennsylvania might be the local rather than the state. Pennsylvania has a slightly different system than Maryland. I gather the zoning process has already completed. Often it's the zoning that determines what kind of thing can be built in a particular place. In Maryland, that's a local government process, and that happens before anybody applies for a pollution permit. I don't know exactly how it works in Pennsylvania, but participating in zoning is really important, because often that's where the yes/no, can this type of thing happen in this particular place, is answered through zoning rather than the pollution permit.
The only other thing I'll say is, if you haven't already, Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act can be helpful in cases like that, because if the development project, or if there's any federal funding involved at all, Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act says you can't use federal funding to discriminate. So, for example, if the increased diesel truck traffic driving to a new development site is going through predominantly black neighborhoods when there's other routes available, or putting kids at risk because they're driving by a school. If the project is getting any sort of federal dollars, it's worth looking into Title VI, but that does involve partnership with legal clinics and things like that. But a lot of times, law schools will have an environmental law clinic, or, and they can be really good community partners, or another sort of nonprofit that has legal assistance. But that Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act can be an important tool if a project receives federal funding. So that's just something else to look into. This is advice from not a lawyer. So, but that's as much as I know about that. But it could be useful to look into. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joseph Jakuda. I'm the Interim Associate Director for the Air Quality Division at the District of Columbia Department of Energy and Environment. Just as with MDE, we are focused, our Air Division is focused on the implementation of the Clean Air Act, air permits, air monitoring, the same sort of situations. At DOEE, we are a little different than MDE in that our energy administration is part of the District of Columbia Department of Energy and Environment, whereas in Maryland it's a separate administration. And then our climate work is also a little different in that we have a different part of DOE that deals with climate. So in the Air Division, we are focused strictly on the health-based air pollution, so the ones that, the toxics and the criteria pollutants that are going to directly impact health. Though obviously many of the solutions that improve those, improve exposures to those pollutions are also going to come with climate benefits in this day and age. So I'm going to just focus on the strict air pollution criteria, air pollutants and toxics. So there's three ways we're addressing EJ in the Air Quality Division. One is increased public engagement and awareness. Second is expanding access to data and collection of data at a hyperlocal level. And then finally, we are reviewing our policies and procedures with an EJ lens. This is the map of the district, so you can kind of get an idea of the communities. All of the communities with the blue color are labeled as disadvantaged in the CGEST tool. We've been focusing a lot of our work on 3 particular communities, Ivy City and Brentwood, where there's a rail yard and a lot of historic industrial sources, smaller industrial sources. Buzzard Point, this is an aggregate facility and has a history of dust pollution, and there was a power plant down there, but that has since been demolished. And then Mayfair, Mayfair is right along a highway and is also historically near a power plant and a landfill that have since been demolished and decommissioned. We also have one of these community monitoring grants. We've taken a similar but different approach. One thing we really wanted to stress was community involvement in this, so we've actually set up an air quality awareness board. It's managed by Empower DC, and what they're doing is getting together community advocates throughout the district, as well as scientific experts to help us make our decisions with where the monitors are going to go and what kind of monitors are going to be in place. There's going to be limitations. It's got to fit within the budget, and we have to make sure it's public accessible because these are going to be park bench monitors. There's an example of one at our zoo where you can sit on the bench, see what the air quality is like. And but we want this community involvement. We're providing them information, and they're going to help us make the decision. There's also going to be a storytelling element where they're actually going out and trying to collect community stories that we're then going to integrate into a mapping tool. The idea is to provide more information directly to the community and make sure we're getting the information that they want to see. Obviously, it's resource constrained, so we will probably have about 3 of these park bench monitors at the end of the project, but we do think it'll be an innovative way to increase community engagement in decision making. Another thing we've done as far as community engagement is our Air Ambassador program. This was, and this also was, we worked with Empower DC on, and essentially we got community members to be trained in understanding air quality, and in particular understanding the air quality permitting process. And then they went out and led efforts in the community to further engage others. Because there's one thing to have a bunch of community members provide comments on a permit. We don't want this, but we wanted them to understand the permitting process so we can use their thoughts and their decisions in concrete ways to improve the permits. Obviously, it still has to fall within our authorities. We also do not have a cumulative impact law in place. But it's helped us to strengthen some of our permits that we're working on. They also are working on trying to get air monitors into homes, and our next step with this is we've invested in a bunch of purple air monitors, and we would like to work with the community to get these purple airs in the community, but not just hand the purple air and have them install them, but all work hand in hand to make sure we're getting scientifically sound data, because those types of sensors, while they're really important, they can also, if not properly installed and maintained, can result in data that's less than indicative of what air pollution is like. We also focused one of our new monitoring stations in an EJ community. Now 4 of our 6 federal monitors are in environmental justice communities, and in this one we also had strong community engagement. We had multiple meetings. We actually decided on locating this monitor in a different place based partially on the community feedback. So I think it was another good example of how listening to the community can help us make better decisions as government officials, because they know the facts on the ground better than some of us do. Because even in a small area like the district, you only know certain parts really well. The last one we're doing is this hyperlocal mobile monitoring project. We're contracting with a company called Acclima. We're on our 2nd phase right now. There's essentially a car that has air sensors in the back that's driving every street in all of the, I'm colorblind, is that orange? The lighter color on the map that's highlighted. Last year, they did the neighborhoods that I discussed earlier, it's the darker color on the map, Ivy City, Brentwood, Mayfair, and Buzzard Point, but we're expanding it. Almost half the district will be mapped, and this is really block by block. This is going to help find if we have hot spots that we don't know about or sources that we don't know about. This is going to help us to make decisions about where to place low-cost sensors if we see some areas make more sense than others. And it's also a great way to communicate with the community about what the air pollution is like in front of your house. And then finally, we were able to use it to help take it to one of the sources in Buzzard Point and help get the permit to be stronger because they saw the impact of their pollution on the community. Obviously, it's not a requirement, but it still is helpful. I guess there was one more slide on monitoring. We're very focused on monitoring. We're also building a low-cost sensor network. If you go to the 2 o'clock session and a different one, sorry, I keep hitting the mic. My colleague Keen over there is going to be presenting in more detail on this. But yeah, essentially we're trying to get purple airs and LTE-enabled sensors, possibly the module airs, possibly clarities. We're not sure which ones yet. We're in procurement now, but we want to get these out in the communities to help more focused mapping and also have more focused air quality alerts. That's not just some monitor a couple miles away from your house. That's not what you're breathing necessarily. So we want people to have a real connection to the information. We're also trying to evaluate our DOE policies with a racial equity lens. We are one of the pilot agencies for implementing what's called the RIO, the Racial Equity Impact Assessment. The idea is that the staff, and then for the pilots anyway, we're going through a particular policy and trying to figure out what stakeholders were impacted, what can change about the policy to benefit overburdened and underserved communities. In the air quality division, we had conducted 4 of these already. One was on our air permitting process. One was on that hyperlocal mobile monitoring with ACLIMA. Another was on the decisions where the Ward 8 monitor was going to go. And then also we conducted one on improving idling enforcement. So you can kind of see from what I was discussing earlier the impacts that the RIA had on these decisions because it led to more community engagement. It led to decisions that we're trying to impact overburning communities more positively. And now we're going to be conducting our second one, and from what I understand, this program is going to start to roll out to other agencies. Oh, the challenges, I guess, same as Chris. It's resources. We don't have the fund. I would love to have idling enforcement personnel throughout the district, but we have 3 staff doing it, so we can only be somewhere at once. And then the funding to maintain these low-cost sensors, we're still trying to figure that out because a lot of it's coming from federal grants. They're short-term. What are we going to do 3 years from now? Trying to get more public participation. Part of the reasons why we concentrated on those 3 neighborhoods, as I said, is because we have a lot of community engagement from those communities. A lot of the new areas, we don't have people that have been knocking on our door for years on end. Like, how do we engage those communities and make sure we're benefiting too? Because if you're living along one of those major highways, you're exposed to air pollution, whether or not you're knocking on our door or not. There's also cross-border issues. We're a very small jurisdiction. We're very impacted by what's going on to the south and the north of us. And making sure our partnerships are long-term, I think is another thing. We don't want to just drop in and, talk for 6 months and then leave. And then, just making sure we're communicating better. We talk in our scientific and our Clean Air Act jargon. No one wants to hear about SIPs. They want to hear about why their air is better. So but we also want to make sure we're precise because, we don't want to say something that's factually incorrect just for the sake of communication. So trying to balance that, make sure we're getting our message across. And that's tough. And we're hoping the air quality awareness board will help us out with that. That's been a big topic so far, how we communicate this scientific stuff better to the community. I know I'm running short on time, so here are the conclusions. You can read them. I think we're doing, we got a lot of work to do, but I think we are making some progress. And if you have any questions after the fact, drop us an email.
Talked about, air quality, that's the kind of data you've seen.
Well, one really interesting thing with the ACMA data was that we were able to see, how things differ the block over. The one neighborhood, Mayfair, we happen to have two FRMs there. We have our near road monitor, which is the monitor supposed to be the worst case for what highway emissions are, and we have another community monitor about half mile away, but still in the same community. So we were able to kind of compare what was going on at those federal monitors with what was going on in the streets. And one good thing was we saw that, obviously that, what's by the near road is not like the best air quality, but we weren't seeing things that were worse than that. Usually it was better, sometimes it was the same, but there was definitely I will say, I think overall we were finding that the FRMs haven't missed anything of note yet, so you could probably assume that what you're breathing is that worst case, but in many cases it's better than that worst case, because once you start to get away from the highway, it's a lot cleaner, and we're measuring a more worst case scenario.
You thought ACMA was successful in
I think it was successful in giving us a snapshot of what was going on. I will say it is very pricey. We cannot continue to do this in the long term. This will be our last go with it, most likely. But having that snapshot will, especially in an urban environment where things can really change so drastically, I think it is going to be good. And it's really going to be good now that we're going into communities that we don't have community members on the ground telling us, oh, there's an auto body shop here that you didn't know about. So I'm hoping we're going to find some of that.
Anything online? All right.
Oh, there's.
Okay. Yeah, Brian.
For things like ACMA and the community-based monitoring programs, is that really a scoping issue? So it sounds like for ACMA, or is that really sufficient for setting out compliance standards and so forth, and using that to really challenge polluters if they are not compliant?
I would say with the ACMA, we do not have a long time period enough data. Like, it's possible that you could be running by a source and they just happen to be testing their emergency generator that day, and otherwise they're not producing much pollution the rest of the month. So we really can't use that too much from a compliance standpoint. I think it's more just generally good information to have, but it's not anything we can use for compliance. That being said, we did take it to a permit session and try to get stronger conditions, but that was voluntary, being able to see, hey, you can see your impact on these, the surrounding neighborhood from this data. But yeah, we wouldn't be able to say that anyone's violating anything from it.
Just so people online heard the question was about sort of community faith in the monitors, right? If there's sometimes you're putting the monitors to get a baseline, but it's not something you can put in, it's not information that then you can use to hold polluters accountable or include in regulation, sort of what are the barriers to having community input, community buy-in for a monitoring system without sort of the regulatory promise? Did I capture that right? Oh, okay. That was for you two, not for me.
Yeah, and that's, I think the hardest question for any of these monitoring projects is what are you going to do with the data? What can you do with the data, right? And so we try beforehand to say, okay, this is what we're measuring and why. And fundamentally, the goal is to figure out where's the problem and then what can we do about that problem. And we know abstractly going in, that's the purpose of the exercise. Once we get the data, the question sometimes is even harder. Because sometimes the data shows that there's a problem, we think air pollution is too high, but it's below the relevant regulatory standards. So we got to dig in further and say, okay, well, we're not necessarily looking at regulatory standards that are often for long time periods of exposure. For example, when we're using data from our regulatory network for regulatory purposes, we need years of data before we actually gather any conclusion, but we can't wait years when we have a local project and we know that there's an issue, so we often have shorter time periods. So then we need to do a lot of analysis to say, okay, what does this data really tell us, and how strong is that evidence, and is it to the point where we can initiate an enforcement action? Is it to the point where we can put new conditions in a permit? And that part's really hard, and it varies on a case-by-case basis. We always know going in, the point is that we want to identify the problems and then figure out the solution to those problems and get strong enough evidence to deploy those solutions. But it doesn't work. It's really hard in every case, and every case so far has not resulted in a specific action. We've got one going right now where we did a lot of really, really new science in the Curtis Bay Community Network that the Community Association and Johns Hopkins deployed, and we contributed a lot of analysis, and we thought that analysis was really compelling. Tracing pollution impacts back to a specific source, and we published that. That specific source brought in some scientists who said, no, that data doesn't actually say that. We've incorporated that evidence, which we believe and we stand by nonetheless, in a permit with some significant new requirements in it that's out for draft, out for comment right now. And I guess we'll see when the outcome, when we end up with a final permit, we go through this whole process, is that satisfying? Is this a success story that we'll point to and say it was really successful? We're still in the process. We're sort of moving as hard and as fast as we can within our legal authority and the evidence we have. But that question, I guess fundamentally the question you're asking will be answered on a case-by-case basis. And I can't tell you what the answer will always be, but from the department's perspective, we're always going to try to push as hard as possible to be get as concrete as possible action as we can, given the law and the science, and that's and get all the resources we can so that the information is actionable. While recognizing it's a really hard thing, and it's a new thing, and we're learning a lot as we're starting it.
I mostly just want to repeat what Chris said, but the only other thing I wanted to add was it also, while this is a less than fulfilling answer, we also do hope this can provide more information to protect oneself. We're trying to look at sort of that from that perspective as well. You know, if we're finding that it makes sense to walk a different way to school, for instance, because you can see that the air pollution is much worse in this location versus this location, you know, empowering people to be able to make the best decision while the change is happening. I know, like I said, it's not we'd much rather everything to be cleaned up right away, and I certainly know, you know, everyone at the agency would, but it is going to take changes in our authorities. It's going to take a lot of long-term change, you know, especially given how much of this is from transportation, at least in the district. It's going to take a while to bring those pollution levels down. So there's also just this element of being able to protect yourself better too, and advocate for yourself.
One thing I'll add from an advocacy perspective, so I work in an advocacy organization, and I think, you know, I was rereading actually a white paper that Dr. Wilson wrote a couple years ago, right before I started at Maryland LCB, to provide us with some information to advocate for, you know, policy change, and it broke down environmental justice legislative options into two approaches, one of which is a protective approach. So you get information and you put in a protective approach to permitting or another type of regulatory process where you say, okay, you know that this area is overburdened for the following reasons, and therefore you have to take additional protective steps in issuing that type of permit, whether that's deeper community engagement and the authority to deny a permit if you have this information, and that's where this sort of like where do you get that information, how do you validate it. That's a protective approach. That's kind of like a say no to something approach. The other approach is an investment approach, and that's a say yes approach. And so you could have environmental justice legislation that says, okay, we know this area is overburdened. How can we target investments? So it's not, and you need both to be very clear. But it's just a different approach. So at the same time you're working on a protective measure, you may also work on an investment, a say yes approach. And so. And you don't, maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but maybe you don't need the regulatory level air pollution monitors to work on that investment approach. And you could try to work on some measures around an investment or a say yes approach, what Dr. Wilson often calls salutogenic infrastructure or health promoting infrastructure. So rather than saying like, no, we don't want this bad stuff, protect us from this, which we should be doing, we can also say, yes, we do want these things, and please help us get these things in our community. And so that's just another approach that you might have this, maybe there's a local air monitoring project that happens that says, we now know this. First of all, we knew this. Thank you for now qualifying what we already knew, by living here. But we have this data, thank you, so now we're going to use it to advocate for investment. Rather than say it doesn't meet the muster to advocate for this protective measure, it might help advocate for the investment measure. So that's sort of a different approach. I think a lot of times we go towards this protection approach, again, which we should, but there's this investment approach too. This what do we want here, in addition to sort of we know what we don't want. So if that's helpful. Any other questions? I have one. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering actually whether with all these monitoring programs that are going on and the use of the screening tools for deciding, whether there should be additional permitting process for decision making out there, whether the monitoring information that you're collecting is going into the screening tools. Because that seems like it's not so easy, but at least one way to really incorporate that into the decision-making process and useful.
So the question, I'll repeat for everyone, with all the community monitoring being deployed, is that data going to find its way into the screening tools? Maybe someday, is my answer. The screening tools draw on dozens of big data sets that are based on state and federal data. And so those don't get updated every day, right? And so the incorporating now for a particular area of the state, we're going to have a different data source because it has a community monitoring project, but for a different part of the state, we're not because it doesn't have one. In a day when we're nowhere near being able to cover every community in these monitors. That would be a hard thing. But improving the tools and improving the data sources is absolutely a process. You may have seen from the screenshot, ours is still in beta, right? These things are new. But those are the kind of ideas that we need to figure out how to improve these tools based on what we can do now versus a longer term approach where this technology, that's one of the promises of this technology.
And then I think to the conversation that was going on about how can the monitoring be used for communities, I think there are some really good examples from the environmental this project. And one of the things that they did is they took some of this information into making decisions and said, here's the information from our communities, and they're seeing that what you're saying is happening in
Well, I guess the question or comment was about what's been going on in Oakland with their use of air monitors and California in general. As with many things with air pollution, California is the vanguard of all of this. They passed a bill, was it in 2019, I think, called AB 617. And I know in the district we've been looking at how that bill has been implemented and trying to take what we can from it with any approach that we undertake. But again, they were granted more ability to make change by their legislature. So that goes sort of back to the challenges that I think we certainly face here, that we are limited in what we can do in the permits until there's some sort of legislative change. But as I said, we are taking the data and at least to the permittees and trying to get as much as we can with the information.
And that's the other thing that the data could be useful for, even if, again, if like a regulatory agency says, sorry, we can't, from this type of monitor, we can't use the data for regulatory change. You can use it for legislative advocacy, right? We're here today with the executive branch representation, but in order to change permitting authority, you need the legislative branch. And so even if you can't submit it as part of a permit for the regulatory change, you can certainly go to your legislator and say, hi, I'm dealing with elevated air pollution every day. You need to become an EJ champion in the legislature because you work for me. So I like to remind people all the time that your legislators work for you. You got them in office and you have that power, and so you can use that data for legislative advocacy. And what did this morning we heard that artists have the responsibility to make the movement inevitable. I'm bumbling the quote, but we can all be artists with that data, right? Like we can be storytellers, we can be artists, and we can use it to inform legislative advocacy. If most of your advocacy is with the executive branch and regulators, and you're getting stuck, perhaps it's legislative advocacy too. So you had a question. Just to repeat the question for the folks online, the question was about replace. So in the city of College Park, where we are, they're looking at replacing streetlights with an LED monitor on the top that will also collect air quality data. Is that right? And then, so asking in DC, are you using that technology? Have you seen it be useful in informing regulatory decisions?
I'm not familiar with that specific type of technology, but I will say that when we put out our LTE-enabled sensors, we are planning on putting them out on assets like streetlights because they will be an ideal location for them. And we don't have to, I don't know, just make it easier. So I'm not sure, though, if in College Park you guys are just winding up with like a purple air sensor that's attached to your streetlight, or if it's a particular type of technology. So maybe we can talk afterwards, as I know that would be interesting if there's a way to cut down on the cost of our program through something like that.
Other questions? Yeah.
monitoring, but the regulations and the actual pieces can be limited because different people are making different decisions, or different regulatory bodies are making decisions, different people are in charge in different parts of the entire process.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, like when the air pollution permit comes So I'm wondering if, since the session is about like crossing those lines and all those things, have you been seeing cooperation from people that are making development decisions to incorporate to a model that you're putting in, like an overworking community, so that they're able to say like, oh, we're also using the screening thing, not just for the permitting process that you were talking about, too late or to just prevent the development from happening, but we're doing this process to stop that at this stage. So do you have any examples of doing that across that at a different regulatory set?
Yeah, thank you for that. The question is about what we've talked about a lot is the air quality monitoring sensors and air quality data being used at a particular point in the regulatory process, and whether that sometimes that's accepted, sometimes it's challenged by data that's brought in from another source. And so where are we seeing some of that data and some of that cooperation, like mapping tools and definitions of overburden community used much earlier in a process, in a planning process, in a zoning process, so that you're not, by the time you get to permitting, often it's too late to take you might be able to tweak a permit or, it's often, not always, often too late to alter development, let's say, of a major project in a significant way. So are there examples of using mapping tools and air quality data much earlier in a process to shape or stop or change that development process?
I have some, I guess I'd say, glass half full examples from the district. We were fortunate that as we were conducting our ACLIMA work, they were redoing, the Office of Planning was redoing two sector plans. The Ivy City sector plan, so right where we were conducting our monitoring, and then the Natty Boroughs sector plan, which is right across from 295 from Mayfair. So we had some good data to be able to provide to them, and we presented the data to them on a couple calls to try and make sure the air pollution information was getting to them and influencing the sector plans. And they made some minor changes to the plan at the basis of it. I think it's going to take more work to get to other agencies and to make sure as they're going through the planning process. Of course, this is also back to resources. This was very time consuming too. So trying to be able to hit all the different sector plans as they're being developed with this information and